George Martin is a master of the fantasy narrative, but in 2018 he stepped outside his comfort zone with Fire and Blood, a non-narrative fictional non-fiction book written in the fictional present about events that happened in the fictional past, for which the fictional author, Archmaester Gyldain, must sift through various fake historical primary sources, all of them biased in different ways. Mushroom the Fool is salacious and pro-Rhaenyra, and Septon Eustace is a tradcon and pro-Greens, and Grandmaster Orwyle, and thus Munkin, were basically pro-Rhaenyra. George makes a clear choice to never definitively say what definitely happened. That's the book, and the show is different. House of the Dragon is its own canon, or rather, it's part of the HBO canon with Game of Thrones and A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, which is separate from A Song of Ice and Fire. Anybody who tells you that House of the Dragon is meant to be the true story of the dance is simply misinformed or lying to you. There is no single, unified, true story of the dance, because the Dance of the Dragons, according to book canon, is a mess of varying, biased sources. However, this has not stopped many folks, including yours truly, inconsequentially, from criticizing House of the Dragon for its departure from book canon. Sounds hypocritical, but I'll explain what I mean. And I've received countless comments, not really countless, but I ain't counting them, telling me I'm a fool for expecting a faithful adaptation, since a faithful adaptation with source material like Fire and Blood is simply impossible. For House of the Dragon to be faithful, they'd have to film it in a fuck-ass mockumentary style, and portray 3 different versions of every key moment. But that isn't what I mean at all, and it takes my use of the word faithful way too literally. This video is about certain obvious structural pieces of George's dance that are true regardless of unreliable narration. I think it does a major disservice to George if we cast off Fire and Blood as a useless text that's unfit to base a TV show around, and to say, well, what did you expect the writers to do? There isn't a real story to adapt. Come on. We can read between the lines of Fire and Blood and parse out even the most basic rubric for how the dance unfolded, and House of the Dragon is still unfaithful to that rubric, as I'll be getting into here. First, I just want to reiterate something I've said before and that I really believe. I don't think it matters how faithful an adaptation is to its source material as long as any changes the adaptation makes are for the better of the story, or the better of the medium it's being told through. Even with an objective narrative like A Song of Ice and Fire, it was impossible for Benioff and Weiss to adapt the story one-to-one in Game of Thrones. In the most pedantic terms, simply changing one line of dialogue or removing one scene means it's no longer a technically faithful adaptation. My point is, you have to change things in an adaptation, but those changes don't have to make the story worse. And in the end, you should still come away with a good TV show regardless of its accuracy to the source material. So let's begin with the times where Ryan Condal had to choose which primary source to adapt. I'll pick a case study of 4 different scenes. First, the demise of Lionel and Harwin Strong. Mushroom suggests that the sea snake was behind it, as an act of vengeance against the man who had cuckolded his son. Septon Eustace, more plausibly, suspects Prince Daemon, removing a rival for Princess Rhaenyra's affections. Others have put forth the notion that Larys Clubfoot might have been responsible. With his father and elder brother dead, Larys Strong became the Lord of Harrenhal. The most disturbing possibility was advanced by none other than Grandmaester Mellos, who muses that the king himself might have given the command. If Viserys had come to accept the rumors about the parentage of Rhaenyra's children were true, he might well have wished to remove the man who had dishonored his daughter, lest he somehow reveal the bastardy of her sons. To adapt this scene in any satisfying manner, you have to choose one of these 4 stories, or make up your own. Condal selected the vague others. No, not these fellas, who blamed the fire on Larys. A good choice, I think, because it's too evil an act for their mostly sympathetic Corlys, and it makes their Daemon seem too jealous and uncool, and he was married to Helaena at the time anyways. Mellos and his King Viserys theory obviously did not jive with their sympathetic characterization of Vizzy. So this made Larys the obvious choice, and Condal followed through by continuing to expound on the toadish, evil ambition of the Clubfoot, gaining a seat on the small council, conspiring to reveal secrets to Otto Hightower, imprisoning Otto as a gift for Daemon when he saw the writing on the wall for Aegon's reign. Second, we can look at the death of Lyman Beesbury. Grand Maester Orwyle tells us that Lord Beesbury was seized at the door by the command of Sir Otto Hightower and escorted to the dungeons. Confined to a black cell, he would, in time, perish of a chill whilst awaiting trial. Septon Eustace tells it elsewise. In his account, Sir Criston Cole forced Lord Beesbury back into his seat and opened his throat with a dagger. Mushroom charges Sir Criston with his lordship's death as well, but in his version, Cole grasped the old man by the back of his collar and flung him out of a window, to die impaled upon the iron spikes in the dry moat below. In this case, Condal chose to write his own version. He kept Criston Cole as the murderer, as both Septon Eustace and Mushroom claimed, but changed it from an intentional killing to an accidental one. No dagger, no toss out of the window, just a bit too much force shoving him back down into his chair, causing an impalation on Beesbury's own little orb thing. Third, the existence of Sarah Snow. Maester Munkin and Septon Eustace both leave her out entirely, and Mushroom's account is the only one that mentions Sarah Snow. That on his visit to Winterfell, Jace fell in love with Cregan Stark's bastard sister, and even married her before a heart tree. Gildane decides that Mushroom is just being Mushroom, and if Sarah Snow did exist, it was simply casual sex between her and Jace, and nothing more. Condal decided that Mushroom was definitely wrong, since there's no Sarah Snow in House of the Dragon, but there really wasn't much of anything to that plotline. We had one scene between Jace and Cregan on the wall, but nothing that Munkin or Eustace claim happened was adapted by Ryan Condal. This was obviously for the sake of brevity, since Condal doesn't like leaving our main characters, Rhaenyra, Alicent, and Daemon, for too long. That means Jace's trip to the Sisters, to White Harbor, and to Winterfell had to be completely skinned to the bone, and Jace doesn't take an active leadership role in Team Black later on either, as he does in the book. This excerpt is a really good example of what I mean by saying there are obvious core tenets of the story which George didn't want to obscure. If Gildane doesn't cast any doubt and is simply stating facts, then we the reader should have no reason to doubt. So what specifically Jace got up to in the North is up for debate, but it's no question that Jace came to the fore after Luke's death while Rhaenyra was beset with grief. Fourth and finally, Aeric and Eric Cargill's fight to the death. According to Maester Munkin, the twins fought for an hour, nobody intervened because they couldn't tell who was who, and they both died after dealing each other mortal wounds. Mushroom's account is shorter, saltier, and altogether nastier. The fight was over in minutes, Sir Aeric died instantly, and Sir Eric died of his wound a few days later. All that Septon Eustace says upon the matter is that the Cargill twins slew each other, and there we must leave it. Ryan Condal made the very easy choice of adapting Munkin's version, which is favored by all the singers and storytellers. So of these 4 case studies, House of the Dragon first chose to adapt others, whoever they might be, then Condal wrote his own version, then sided with Munkin and Eustace on the non-existence of Sarah Snow, and finally with Munkin on Cargill Bowl. My point here is that, when he wants to, Condal has the liberty of choosing any or none of the sources in Fire and Blood. House of the Dragon, then, is one interpretation of Fire and Blood, and chooses which narrative to trust, exactly as George Martin asks us, the readers, to do. Maesters and other scholars must make their own determination as to which version is more likely. But this only works for specific events. Sources differ on how Lyman Beesbury died, but George is telling us that Lyman Beesbury did die right at the beginning of the dance for his support of Queen Rhaenyra. And there are other events where George, through Gildane, is straight up telling us what happened, instead of listing out 3 different versions from 3 different sources. Blood and Cheese is one such example. Gildane does not refer to Munkin, Eustace, or Mushroom in his 8 paragraphs on Blood and Cheese. There is zero ambiguity about how Blood and Cheese sneaked through the Red Keep, found Queen Alicent, tied her up and waited for Helaena and her kids, and slew Jaehaerys. No ambiguity that it was Mysaria who hired them, that Daemon had sent word to Rhaenyra of his intent for revenge, that Helaena sunk into madness, and Aegon got drunk and raged. My point being, George makes it extremely obvious when we should be taking the text at face value, and when we should be questioning it. I won't linger on Blood and Cheese, because House of the Dragon's divergence from the source material here doesn't have drastic effects on the overall narrative. I do prefer George's version, and I think Condal's changes were negative, especially that Alicent and Cole were having sex during the murder, while it would be more impactful if Alicent was a witness to the murder, as George wrote. But that's just a microcosm of my main argument, which concerns the characterizations of Alicent and Rhaenyra. These ladies are the main characters of the dance. Recall that the very first portion of the dance that George ever published was this novella titled The Princess and the Queen, for an anthology put out by Tor Books. That was in 2013, a year before The World of Ice and Fire, and 5 years before Fire and Blood. Alicent and Rhaenyra are the heart of the conflict. The dance doesn't happen, or at least happens very differently, if Alicent doesn't instill a fear and hatred of Rhaenyra into Aegon, and prepare the Green faction to usurp her. And the dance doesn't happen if Rhaenyra isn't Rhaenyra, the first female heir to the Iron Throne. George Martin was not going to subject the characterizations of his two most critical characters to his biased sources shtick. He makes it super clear who Alicent and Rhaenyra are supposed to be, and that's where the core of my argument lies. While certain events in Fire and Blood are ambiguous, Alicent and Rhaenyra are not. And by changing them both so drastically, House of the Dragon was unfaithful to its source material in a way I believe irrevocably damaged the TV series. Alicent couldn't witness blood and cheese, sitting there helpless while an agent of Rhaenyra murders her grandson, because you can't witness something like that and then have any goodwill in your heart for the woman responsible. And they couldn't make Rhaenyra responsible, or complicit as she was in the book, because the writers forced themselves to leave open a bridge between Rhaenyra and Alicent. As long as it doesn't go too far, and it's other people causing the real harm, like Aegon and Aemond and Daemon, then the door is open for Alicent and Rhaenyra to work together, instead of hating each other's guts. The issue is that Ryan Condal's version just isn't as compelling as George Martin's. In an effort to avoid any mad woman tropes, and to portray Alicent and Rhaenyra as ultimately righteous, non-violent, peaceful leaders who continually get overtaken by the violent men around them, House of the Dragon is actually being misogynist. Listen, there's a fair argument to be made against some of George's weird proclivities when writing his female characters, but I think most of us can agree that his women are better written than just about any others. Not just in fantasy stories written by boomer male authors, but especially in that genre, George is leaps and bounds more progressive than the mean. In Martin's own words, this is because,
I've always considered women to be people. One of the hardest things as a writer is to write someone who's not yourself. I've never been an 11-year-old girl, so the question is, how do you write these characters? But then the main thing is empathy, is saying, well, okay, how would I feel? Because the character is still a person. There's a certain basis of common humanity. And that's true when writing about women or writing about a dwarf or writing about any of this. You have to start with the basis. They're more like me than they are unlike me.
Right.
They have.
Way back in 1999, he said, "I like women. Hell, I like women a lot. But in the end, I try to write all my characters as people. All characters are built on observation of those around you, and observation of yourself as well, since all of us, male and female, have many of the same basic drives. I have written the viewpoint of dwarfs, aliens, werewolves, vampires, and many other fantastic creatures, all a lot more different from myself than a woman. And besides, if I screw up, one of the women in my life is sure to tell me." So I'll argue that Fire and Blood really isn't that hard to adapt if you simply trust George Martin's writing instead of completely altering the characterizations of the two most crucial women to the story. George writes, using Orwell's first-hand account and direct quotes, that Rhaenyra declared, "Tell my half-brother that I will have my throne, or I will have his head." I think it's completely unserious to argue any ambiguity in this passage. While he leaves the door open for alternate scenarios, George is still trying to tell us the story of the dance, and part of that story is Rhaenyra's passion for her throne. What's really a shame is that House of the Dragon Season 1 gave us glimpses of George Martin's story, scenes which are great in a vacuum but have turned incongruous with the rest of the show. Even if we didn't get this particular line from Rhaenyra, the TV show invented this wonderful scene on Driftmark between her and Daemon.
I need you, Uncle.
Rhaenyra asks Daemon to marry her to solidify her claim to the throne and make her more difficult to challenge. But by the end of the season, a couple years later in universe, Rhaenyra is wary to fight, and a short time later, after Lucerys dies, Rhaenyra is still trying to find a different solution. What's more compelling, a power-hungry princess scorned by her own relatives who's ready to fight till death for her rightful claim? Or a hesitant woman still unsure whether to unleash fire and blood even after they've killed one of her sons? In the first 7.5 episodes, we had that scene of Rhaenyra asking Daemon to help her fight the Greens, Rhaenyra apparently being okay with an innocent Velaryon servant getting murdered for her own benefit. I say apparently because we don't see Rhaenyra discussing the plan, but where else would Daemon get a fake body to pretend was Laenor? I'm sure Rhaenyra knew. Alicent grooming Aegon into fearing what would happen if Rhaenyra ascended the throne, Alicent holding a knife at Rhaenyra to bring her down a peg and avenge her son's eye. This is all stuff Ryan Condal invented for the show. It doesn't even get mentioned in Fire and Blood as a possibility of maybe occurring, and it's great. They proved in Season 1 that they could make up their own subplots in the service of characterizing the true Rhaenyra and Alicent. But of course, that crumbled away at the dinner scene in 108, and especially the Green Council scene in 109, where Alicent, the Queen of Westeros, completely lacks agency just 2 episodes after telling Viserys,
"You may do as you wish, husband, when I am cold in my grave."
What happened to this Alicent? To be fair, we have gotten sprinkles of the real Rhaenyra and Alicent post-Season 1. She essentially sacrificed Sir Steffon Darklyn in an effort to increase her own power, sort of like the sacrifice of that Velaryon servant. And up until this scene in the Season 2 finale, which irreversibly plunged House of the Dragon into the abyss, Alicent was participating on Aegon's council and trying to figure out a way for them to win. And to the writer's credit, they've always nailed the characterization of Aegon. He and Aemond are the most devoutly anti-Rhaenyra men in the Red Keep, so it's a shame they invented this rivalry between them instead of how close they were in the book, because it just further fractures Team Green along with their mother Alicent's pro-Rhaenyra sympathies. Again, this was something totally invented by Ryan Condal with no basis in Fire and Blood, but unlike some of these great Rhaenyra scenes they invented, the Aegon vs. Aemond feud makes the show as a whole less compelling. All it does is make Rhaenyra seem better and more mature by comparison, thus making Team Green into embarrassing, violent idiots even more so than in Fire and Blood. We don't need the extra help understanding that Team Green are the bad guys, so at least make them a united front of bad guys. Getting an audience invested in the bad guys is really difficult, so by having Alicent turn against her own sons, and by having Aemond try to murder Aegon, the intended effect is that we see them more dynamically, but the actual effect is that we don't want to see them at all. This brings me to my next point about scenes that just obviously didn't happen in Fire and Blood despite your whining about unreliable narration. Scenes which I think truly made House of the Dragon unsalvageable as a decent adaptation. Even after the dinner party scene, Alicent toasting Rhaenyra, misunderstanding Viserys' last words, and being a bystander to the Green Council, the series was still salvageable. But the 2 meetings between Alicent and Rhaenyra during Season 2 completely lost me. I obviously still watch House of the Dragon because it's mostly a good TV show if you forget it's supposed to be a Fire and Blood adaptation. The performances are great, the music by Ramin Djawadi is great, the set pieces and dragons are all nice to look at, but these 2 scenes, first in episode 203 and then in 208, did irreversible damage to the narrative. I've analyzed how Ryan Condal may choose a certain source to adapt from Fire and Blood, and how he'll invent great scenes himself that contextually fit with Fire and Blood, but a peaceful meeting between Rhaenyra and Alicent, especially after the deaths of both Lucerys and Jaehaerys, is completely antithetical to the story of the dance, completely antithetical to the narrative House of the Dragon itself introduced in its first 7.5 episodes, and, worst of all, makes these 2 main characters far less compelling regardless of their book inaccuracy. Let's take this passage for example. Broken by the loss of one son, Rhaenyra Targaryen seemed to find new strength after the loss of a second. Jace's death hardened her, burning away her fears, leaving only her anger and her hatred. Gul'dane presents this with 0 ambiguity and 0 reliance on any primary source. This means as part of the basic narrative that George is trying to tell us. House of the Dragon seems to have nailed the second part of this message, a hardened Rhaenyra after Jace's death storming into the Red Keep and seizing the Iron Throne. but failed to adapt the first part of this passage. After Luke died, the season 1 finale ended on this brutal face mog by Emma Darcy. Here, Rhaenyra was angry and hateful, but she was meant to be broken. And when season 2 began, Rhaenyra doesn't recede into the background with grief as Prince Jacaerys rises to the foreground. Instead, she wishy-washily tries to sort of fight the Greens while being reluctant to use actual force, to the point that she tries to negotiate a peace while cosplaying a septa. Why is Rhaenyra disallowed to feel overwhelming grief for Viserys, Visenya, and Lucerys, who all died within days of each other while the Greens were usurping her throne? The storylines they invented for Rhaenyra instead make her seem weak-willed in her effort for non-violent peace, shrill and emotional in her disputes with her own small council, and overall reluctant and incapable. Not exactly the picture of feminine strength. Here's another passage, witnessed firsthand by Septon Eustace using direct quotes, a detail I interpret as George letting us the readers know this really happened. Septon Eustace, a witness to what followed, tells us that Queen Alicent attempted to treat with her stepdaughter. "Let us together summon a great council, as the old king did in days of old," said the Dowager Queen, "and lay the matter of succession before the lords of the realm." But Queen Rhaenyra rejected the proposal with scorn. "Do you mistake me for mushroom?" she asked. "We both know how this council would rule." Then she bade her stepmother choose, yield or burn. Bowing her head in defeat, Queen Alicent surrendered the keys to the castle and ordered her knights and men-at-arms to lay down their swords. "The city is yours, princess," she is reported to have said, "but you will not hold it long. The rats play when the cat is gone, but my son Aemon will return with fire and blood." This is a perfect picture of both Rhaenyra's and Alicent's characters at this time. Alicent trying to wiggle out of danger, Rhaenyra refusing to let others decide what would happen, and Alicent declaring how Aemon will return with fire and blood. Instead of blaming the violent men in their lives for their present circumstances,
You to pass, I have done all I could. Will you blame me only for what men have done?
Alicent uses her violent men as a means of grasping power, while Rhaenyra uses her own power to take power away from those violent men. There would be no small council. Anybody who opposes her can die, and we'll start with your dad, Otto Hightower. Episode 302 basically adapts this from Rhaenyra's side, which is probably why I enjoyed that episode so much more than anything in Season 2. But of course, Alicent is beyond saving at this point. She's trying to escape through the city because she's just negotiated a deal to give up her sons for death and to cede the throne to Rhaenyra. Another obviously that didn't happen moment is the matter of Helena's death. She dies in fire and blood, but the context is different. Some folks commented on my Chris view of that episode how Helena's death in the book, a sudden choice to end her life after the shocking news of Maelor's gruesome murder, isn't all that accurate to real-life depression, that there isn't usually one triggering event, but rather a build-up over a long time. I think that's a very fair point to make, but it's not totally relevant here because George Martin isn't writing an accurate depiction of the average suicide. Helaena Targaryen is a fictional character completely at George's mercy to do whatever he wants with. So the argument that Helena's book death is unrealistic just doesn't hold much water to me. Helaena isn't like us in many ways, and if George wants his character to end her life in response to a particularly horrifying event, then that's the character. House of the Dragon chose to keep Helena's death, but under different circumstances. Maelor is in her tummy, not in dozens of pieces scattered over Bitterbridge. In the show, Helena's death is a culmination of several weeks under house arrest, which she's uneager to escape because she wants to stay with Jaehaera. And then Alicent leaves on a mission to Harrenhal, Rhaenyra treats her quite poorly with a demand for answers about her dragon dreams and the force feeding, and Mysaria warns her that her situation is not likely to get any better. Helaena opts to escape her prison through the window. My critique is that Hel's decision in the show seemed like a rather sudden change of heart, considering her insistence on living just several episodes previously. She refuses Alicent's moon tea, intent on having her baby and keeping it, and she only reluctantly agrees to try escaping under the promise that Jaehaera was coming with them. What exactly changed in Helena's circumstances that made her want to die? If it really was just a realization that she was doomed to be Rhaenyra's prisoner forever, that's understandable in a vacuum, but doesn't jive with her earlier insistence on sticking around for her children. You could also argue that Helena's dream of her newborn being taken away from her, a dream she has after insisting that she keeps her child, convinced Helaena of her upcoming doom, that it was a dragon dream she believed would come true. I'm willing to hold space for that, since the writers included that dream for a reason, but it came attached to these rather peaceful moments with her children on a farm raising chickens. The sky does turn ominous, I suppose, and Jaehaerys is alive here, suggesting maybe this is a dream of heaven? Are these dreams what convinced Helaena to jump? Despite the muddiness here, you have to admit it's the mark of a good TV show that it can spawn all this speculation and analysis, even if I might prefer something more concrete in this specific instance. I wonder if the writers wrote Helena's ending before the events leading up to it, a destination without a route. At least George's version is concrete, and I do think the reasoning behind a queen's suicide needs to be portrayed concretely. Regardless, House of the Dragon remains interesting enough that I still care enough to make these sorts of videos about, and that's why I still really enjoy House of the Dragon as a show, setting aside the fact it's meant to be a Fire and Blood adaptation. And this scene isn't even structurally damaging to the entire series the way Alicent and Rhaenyra's characterizations are. My point is that Helena's death was a situation where Condal had to invent his own context because he chose not to adapt Maelor. And I don't envy the difficult task of writing her death, but I think it could have been done a little bit better.
You've done nothing but whinge.
I've done a lot of complaining now, so first I'll give my own amateur take on how Alicent could be better written, and then I'll praise some of House of the Dragon's choices that I love, because they do exist. Instead of trying to maintain an even parallel between Alicent and Rhaenyra throughout the entire narrative, the parallel being that neither of their voices are respected by the men around them, and they're left picking up the pieces of their counselors' violent decisions, it would be more compelling to start with that, like they did in early Season 1, but then move Alicent the complete opposite direction, turning her into the spiteful, basically hateful matriarch that she is in Fire and Blood. The sort of woman you'd believe capable of this little in-universe theory from the book, that Alicent wished to bathe in the blood of her grandson's murderer's family. I'm not saying this happened, and neither is Archmaester Gyldain, but I'd prefer an Alicent who at least felt this way, instead of an Alicent who, even after said murder of her grandson, negotiates a peace deal with Rhaenyra to give her the throne. I think it'd be a lot cooler if Alicent was actually egging Team Green on to more violent action, that she's actually being listened to and has the agency to affect outcomes of the war. For example, instead of telling Aegon he's useless, do the opposite. Make him think he's fierce enough to destroy the Blacks all on his own, burn them for what they did to Jaehaerys, and then Aegon's mutilation being a result of his own mother's urging him to fight. The natural conclusion of the fear-mongering we saw Alicent do to Aegon way back in Season 1. That would at least be consistent writing. Or instead of admonishing Aemon for burning Sharp Point, suggest that he go even further, that when he becomes the terror of the Trident, it's at least partially at the behest of Queen Alicent. Basically, I'm advocating for an Alicent whose years of being manipulated by her father into acting as a perfectly quiet and dutiful lady, and years of experience administering the realm only for that to be challenged by her spoiled childhood friend turned enemy, that she becomes almost Cersei-esque in her mad pursuit of destroying Team Black and protecting her son's rule. Meanwhile, I've sort of talked myself into not hating Rhaenyra's arc on Dragonstone, where she's not obeyed by her own son or her council, creating a juxtaposition now instead of a parallel to Alicent, whose word finally is being obeyed, in my version of the story. And then for Rhaenyra to ultimately lose it after Jace dies at the Gullet, conquer King's Landing with Daemon, and basically rule with an iron fist so that she may finally hold on to her own power until it becomes her downfall, therefore breaking the juxtaposition between Alicent and Rhaenyra and bringing them into a parallel once more. Both women are ruined by their bloodlust, their thirst for revenge for what each other's side has done. The point of the story being that nobody is spared from corruption during a war like this one. There are no heroes in the end, only broken pieces of the two women who began the story as childhood best friends, who might have led happy lives together if circumstances were different, but who instead get swallowed up in the Game of Thrones. Now, I'm not saying my version is exactly book accurate either, but I think it's more faithful to George's characters and the main gist of the dance. And I'm also stupid, and I'm not a professional screenwriter. So let me know down in the comments what you would change about House of the Dragon. If anything, perhaps you love it the way it is, and how you'd go about adapting Fire and Blood. Before I quit yapping, I want to spread a teensy bit of positivity. House of the Dragon turned Criston Cole into a really interesting character out of basically nothing. His entire arc in the TV series is original, and I think they've made a far better character than George's version, who I'd classify as one-dimensional even for a book full of one-dimensional characters written in a non-narrative format. His arc on the show concerns knighthood and honor. How can Cole live with himself after breaking his vows, and after Rhaenyra refuses to run away with him? He turns to Alicent Hightower, his beacon, who saved him from suicide and shares his frustration with Rhaenyra. This evolves into Criston losing his inhibition, breaking his vows again, this time with Alicent, and even wearing her favor into battle. But for the first time, he experiences dragon warfare, and Cole's entire worldview is shattered into a defeatist mentality. What is the point of vows and honor when men are like dust beneath dragons' feet? When men will all turn to monsters before their end? He's marching towards his own annihilation, and he is resigned to it. All the bravery and chivalry and honor in the world is pointless if that world is ruled by dragons. So what's the point? This sort of mental health arc, or PTSD arc, for my lack of finding a better term, is pretty unique for a TV show about swords and dragons. At least they're trying to do actual character growth with Criston, which is something they've utterly failed at with Alicent. And I think even George Martin would have to agree that Cole is one of the better written characters on House of the Dragon. He's this show's version of Jaime Lannister, who falls out of love with the chivalric identity of a White Knight of the Kingsguard, not because he feels worthless in a world ruled by dragons, but because the entire country hates him for the most benevolent act he ever did. He really can't embrace the fact that he did a heroic deed, so instead he embraces the villainy of it all. Jaime's and Criston's negative personalities are both colored by illegal sexual affairs as well, adding to their torment. My only qualm is that he should have played a more prominent role in Team Green's crowning of Aegon. In the book, he really earns his Kingmaker moniker, and Pate the Longleaf's final condemnation of Criston hits way softer in the show. I'll have no songs about how brave you died, Kingmaker. There's tens of thousands dead on your account. Because in the show, the war was happening with or without Criston Cole. Tens of thousands aren't dead on his account, but on Otto's and Ironrod's and the Lannisters and mostly Viserys' account. But I guess that's a nitpick. And a lot of you can find positives in the show as well. Maybe House of the Dragon hasn't turned into the adaptation we all hoped for, but I asked my audience to say a few nice things about the show, and there's plenty to choose from. I'll conclude that while I think an adaptation of the Dance of the Dragons doesn't work if you change Alicent's and Rhaenyra's characterizations so drastically, it really doesn't matter because House of the Dragon is an entertaining show at the very least, and we still have the book, and only the books are canon. I don't super F with Ryan Condal's vision, but I'll defend his right to portray it, and I wouldn't do any better in his position. Let me know all your thoughts down below in the comments. How would you adapt Fire and Blood? As always, this video is brought to you by my Patreon. For $5 per month, you'll get early access to every video I make, some exclusive stuff like my Crusader Kings Game of Thrones mod playthroughs, and it's a way to support me directly if you enjoy my channel. Thank you to everybody whose name is on screen right here, and thanks to all of you as well for watching and subscribing. Alright, love you, goodbye.